Let's start with the before lecture chant. An unsurpassed, penetrating, and perfect Dharma is rarely met with, even in 100,000 million kalpas. Having it to see and listen to remember and accept, I vow to taste the truth of the Tathagata's words. Good morning, everybody. In the introduction to her book, Standing at the Edge, that we've been discussing, Roshi Joan explains the importance of compassion, specifically as it relates to these 5 edge states of altruism and empathy and integrity and respect and engagement that we've been looking at. And quite simply, in her opinion, compassion is the key. It's the key to maintaining our balance when we find ourselves at this precipice on the high side of any or all of these states. And these 5 are in fact an interdependent system. They all work together. They all influence each other. And they actually help to form our very character. And in her words, they actually develop on the ground of other systems, such as our interpersonal relationships, our workplace, our institutions, society, or even within our own bodies and our own minds. We find these 5 edge states working together and supporting each other. And it takes little thought to imagine any one or more of these systems starting to change, perhaps in small, but maybe very significant ways, and how these changes might affect us, so that we find ourselves at the point of falling, or giving up, or struggling, or suffering more. But it is compassion for ourselves, others, and the world in which we stand, and in which we stay grounded. And if we do fall, it's compassion that is actually our way back. It helps us to stand at this threshold of change with a clearer view, one that is more vast, one that is more wise, more kind. And it's how we find freedom at the edge. It is how we discover that this vital mix of our suffering and our compassion brings out the very best of us, the best in our character and the best of our hearts. A part of this chapter is subtitled Survival of the Kindest. And that's a phrase that's actually attributed to Darwin, who concluded that compassion, and he actually referred to compassion as sympathy, but he concluded that compassion is essential for our very survival. Similarly, the Dalai Lama repeatedly reminds us that compassion is not a luxury, it's a necessity for us to continue. The Buddha taught that to realize enlightenment, a person must develop 2 qualities, compassion and wisdom, like 2 wings that work together in order to allow us to fly, or 2 eyes that work together to see deeply. And we often refer to our 2 hands, for instance, in the meditation mudra, as wisdom and compassion, working and supporting each other. So compassion is our ability to turn toward the truth of suffering and the wish to relieve that suffering. Is all compassion the same, though? And I think you can sense an answer to this, maybe. If I asked you if all love is the same, perhaps we would take a moment and we could feel the love we have for a child, our parent, our spouse, good friends, our pets, humanity in general. It likely seems not quite the same. We can also say that compassion has more than one face, more than one perspective. And Roshi refers to these three faces: referential compassion, insight-based compassion, and non-referential compassion. And I briefly spoke about these when I was discussing compassion during our study of Thich Nhat Hanh's The Heart of the Buddha's Teaching. But I just want to bring them up quickly here today. So referential compassion is compassion that we direct towards what we might call our group, our friends, our colleagues, our family, Sangha. But also, it can be people with whom we have a connection or feel connected or an affinity with. So it might include, even though we don't know them, it might include people who are victims of domestic abuse because we have an affinity towards that. Or it could be towards animals or specific places. The second face of compassion you're very familiar with, insight-based compassion. It's an understanding that actually we're morally compelled to act. It's just the right thing to do. And if we don't, we understand that there may be unwelcome consequences for us, for others, and for society in general, and our planet. And we can think of this as our vow, our aspiration to relieve suffering. And lastly is what Roshi calls non-referential compassion. This is compassion without an object. And in her words, it's unbiased. It's unintentional. It's unpremeditated. This is universal compassion. She suggests that this is true compassion. This is the compassion we feel that at its heart is not about the small self, but rather a moment in which our own suffering just melts away amidst our boundless compassion for others. And this is our original self. This is of our original self. And it's available to us in an instant for anyone and everyone. So compassion really is fundamental to these 5 edge states that we've been talking about. And in fact, compassion has an edge. A number of challenges, we might actually call them. It's not entirely like the 5 edge states we have been looking closely at, but compassion, like all the beneficial qualities of the mind in Buddhism, the other 3 being loving kindness, sympathetic joy, and equanimity, compassion also has what are called near and far enemies. Far enemies are opposites. The far enemy of compassion, for example, is cruelty. Near enemies, on the other hand, are much harder to discern and detect. Roshi explains that near enemies actually are unhelpful qualities that masquerade as helpful. Near enemies of compassion could include pity, or fear, or outrage. And we can sense how these 3 could be misunderstood as compassion by us and also by others who are witnessing our actions and our words. But you know, these guys are masters of disguise. They're fooling even ourselves into believing we are still standing firm on the high edge. You know, pity is a deceptive concern for those who are suffering, often with a dose of judgment that is not always hidden. When I was thinking about pity, I recall very clearly a conversation I had with a friend's mother after the devastation, the natural devastation in Haiti in the early 2000s. And she was recounting that people in her Catholic congregation were collecting clothes and personal hygiene items and food and things like that to send to Haiti. So they were collecting them and putting them in boxes and mailing them off. And she spent a few minutes talking about it, a bit about how sad it was. People were really suffering, and how sorry she felt for those people. And she talked a lot about their own good work, helping these helpless people. And at the end, she sighed, shaking her head, and she said something like, they can't take care of themselves, so we need to help. And I have to say, this was really thinly disguised compassion. Now, and at that time, it felt heartless to me. It felt cruel. It felt disconnected. And this is the first time in my life, actually, that I think I understood pity and how destructive it can be. Sometimes there also might be fear around being compassionate, as it may feel like we're being overly emotionally involved. A fear of losing one's boundaries, maybe. Or the real fear of knowing you're nearing the edge of burnout or distress that we have talked about. At one of the hospice organizations that I volunteer with, as part of the training, volunteers are told that their relationship to the patient and the patient's family is very, very clear. The hospice team is outside of the family circle, not inside of it. And it's easy to understand why such guidance exists, I think. Boundaries can easily be crossed, both ways, by us, the team, and by the patient and families. So there's a balance that we need to find that supports a compassionate presence and a compassionate response. But it also honors the boundaries of the family circle. It is in this way that we are able to continue to serve, even in the most difficult situations, and without fear. But there are many traps to compassion in which we can get caught. Perhaps we feel we are judged, as an example, by how compassionate we seem or how compassionate we act. If so, maybe our compassionate response may actually be an act to gain approval or acceptance by maintaining a facade of a compassionate human being. That's what I am. I'm a compassionate human being. Another, which we've talked about many times, is the feeling of being simply overwhelmed. When the problems just seem so large and so inconceivable that we start to pull back and we kind of put this off to the side. And maybe we just do nothing at all. You know, Roshi points to some interesting research that shows that as the size of the suffering group itself grows, so the more people that we understand are suffering, our desire to help declines exponentially. The more people who need help, the less apt we are to help. And you may have felt this in relation to the suffering as a result of terrible natural disasters, fires and tsunamis, for example, or the war in Ukraine. But actually, it's not a reality that there's nothing one can do, really. We're just stuck. We're stuck in the unhealthy manifestations of the edge states. And how do we get out? By looking at the very obstacles to our compassion, by turning toward ourselves and our suffering and acknowledging what it is, that it exists, and then discerning how to take the next step, how to respond appropriately. And as always, is always important, without judging ourselves. You know, at times we can easily sense the discomfort of compassion. It doesn't always feel good. When turning towards suffering, we might feel uncomfortable. It might be unsettling, difficult, maybe even scary. But these feelings can also serve as powerful motivators to recognize the suffering and try to understand it. This is what we do in our practice. We are practicing openness. We are learning to act compassionately towards ourselves and all living beings. Mel Weitzman Roshi, who was the abbot of Berkeley Zen Center, spoke of Zazen as the ground of compassion, where we look at our own challenges, even the pain or tension in our body on the cushion, our own challenges, and we learn to stay compassionate in the midst of suffering, even physical discomfort on our cushion. And it requires determination and steadfastness. It requires us to sit still, to not give up. Even when we shift our position on the cushion a bit in an effort to ease some discomfort, we do this without judging ourselves, just accepting it and accepting ourselves as we are. And it is this which makes it possible to come alongside others and be of support to them. Our very breath, then, is just an abiding in our composure and an abiding in our compassion. In Buddhism, there's perhaps no figure more known or revered for compassion than the Bodhisattva of compassion, Avalokiteshvara. Guanyin in Chinese and Kannon in Japanese. And although this Bodhisattva is often, especially historically, been referred to as the masculine, in Mahayana Buddhism, and in Zen in particular, he is often depicted and talked of as feminine. And there are over 100 different manifestations of Avalokiteshvara. But you'll probably easily recognize the depiction of the Bodhisattva with 1,000 arms. Each hand of each arm with an eye in the palm. And various tools. She has various tools for helping those she is hearing. And it's widely accepted the first written account of Avalokiteshvara is actually in the Lotus Sutra, where there's an entire chapter devoted to this Bodhisattva, describing at that time, in the Lotus Sutra he's called a male, so describing him as a compassionate Bodhisattva who hears all the cries of the sentient beings and who works tirelessly to help those who call upon his name. The original story, and so how it is written, is, I think, a really interesting one. The prominent Buddhist story tells of Avalokiteshvara vowing never to rest until he had freed all sentient beings from samsara, which is this cycle of death, rebirth, death, rebirth. And despite his strenuous effort, he realizes that there are still so many unhappy and suffering beings that yet need to be saved. He feels he cannot save them all. And after struggling for quite some time to understand the needs of so many people, so many beings, the story goes, his head splits into 11 pieces. And the Buddha Amitabha, seeing this happening to him, gives him 11 heads with which to hear the cries of the suffering. And upon hearing these cries and comprehending them, Avalokiteshvara tries to reach out to all those who needed aid, but found that his 2 arms were not enough, and they too shattered into pieces. Once more, Buddha Amitabha comes to his aid and gives him 1,000 arms with which to serve all those who are suffering. There are many different ways this compassionate being is depicted, but usually the eyes are cast down, looking not only inward into the mind and heart, but also downward to witness the suffering of the entire world. These different depictions also appear as the wish-fulfilling Avalokiteshvara, the pure one, the fierce one, the wise one, and many more. In other words, the many forms of Avalokiteshvara show us so many ways of acting that enable us to serve other beings with compassion. And may we all remember and be guided by the wise words of Thich Nhat Hanh. Compassion is a verb. So for us, being deeply aware of another person's suffering and then acting to relieve that suffering is true compassion.